Dear colleagues and fellows, ladies and gentlemen, and especially dear Frank C. Worrell. A very warm welcome to the Marsilius lecture for the winter semester 2023-24 here at the old auditorium of Heidelberg University. My name is Friederike Nüssel. Together with my colleague Michael Boutros, I'm co-director of the Marsilius-Kolleg, the Interdisciplinary Institute for Advanced Study at Heidelberg University. This is the 32nd edition of our long-standing series, and we are looking forward with great anticipation to today's lecture on time constructs. Our speaker is a distinguished expert in school psychology and educational research, who has had close ties to Heidelberg in research and teaching for many years. As those who already met him will know, he is not a cricket player, even if he was named after one, but an avid singer who has conducted and toured with many choirs over the years. And he is fond of German poets, some of whom also called Heidelberg their home. The biannual Marsilius lecture are a true highlight for our colleague and the general scientific community in Heidelberg. Outstanding scholars are invited to talk on a topic that transcends disciplinary boundaries. These topics often relate to current societal challenges or scientific innovations. Recent speakers have addressed breakthroughs in health research, political conflicts, philosophical questions about digitalization and automation, or ecological concerns. The lectures stimulate the interdisciplinary exchange at the Marsilius-Kolleg with new ideas and impulses. They also make an important contribution to the public communication of science at our university. Today's speaker, Frank Worrell, was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Faculty of Behavioral and Cultural Studies for his outstanding research on protective and risk factors in the academic and social development of adolescents in June 2023. A term that comes up repeatedly when Frank Worrell describes his personal and academic journey is serendipity. Growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, he went to the University of Western Ontario as a first-generation college student, and through a series of coincidences ended up switching his major from English to psychology. In Canada, he completed both his bachelor's degree in psychology in 1985 and his master's degree in educational psychology in 1987. He then went to Trinidad to work as a teacher, counselor, and principal for a private school that focused on students who were at risk of not graduating under the federal school system. Frank Worrell's experiences at that school informed his research interests and led him to pursue a PhD at the University of Berkeley, which offered one of the few school psychology programs in the United States at that time. He received his PhD in 1994 and proceeded to teach for almost 10 years at the Pennsylvania State University, ultimately returning to Berkeley as professor and director of the School of Psychology program in 2004. Since then, he has continuously advanced Berkeley School of Education and fostered extensive collaborations with researchers from all over the world. Currently, Frank Worrell is a distinguished professor at the School of Education, as well as the faculty director of the Academic Talent Development Program and the California College Preparatory Academy. He researches both the development of academic talent and the education of at-risk youth, as well as topics like teaching effectiveness, cultural identities, and the translation of psychological research findings into school-based practice. His research on time perspectives has also been extensively received internationally. The adolescent and adult time inventory time attitude scales he developed have now been translated into numerous languages. In addition to his teaching and research obligations, Frank Worrell is and has been a member of countless councils, editorial boards, associations, and committees. For example, he was elected to the Society of the Study of School Psychology in 2007 and to the National Academy of Education in 2018, co-edited the Review of Educational Research from 2012 to 2016, and became a fellow of the American Educational Research Association in 2015. Most prominently, he recently served as the 2022 president of the American Psychological Association. I could go on and list the many merits of Frank Worrell he has received, the visiting professorships he has held, or the over 300 scientific articles and book chapters he has authored. But let me end now by expressing our heartfelt gratitude to you, Frank Worrell, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for the lecture you are about to deliver. Once again, a very warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
I thought I was over being nervous at giving talks, but that's not quite the case. Good afternoon, everybody, honored guests, the rector, and the directors of the Marsilius-College. Thank you for this kind invitation to be with you today. It's quite an honor to join the list of eminent scholars who have participated in this. And while I hope you enjoy my talk, I am comforted by the fact that however my talk is received, we started with such a wonderful duet, cello and piano, that in fact it will be a good evening, whatever I do subsequently. And so for that, I am grateful. It's also, as I was sitting watching the very stylized picture of myself on stage, which my students have told me makes me look much better than I am, I was listening to the music and thinking that I'm talking about time, and of course music moves through time. So I think things are coming together. So today, it is my hope to take you on a journey on my research on time over the last few years, starting with some general views of time, and then going into, in fact, my developing interest in this construct in graduate school, the risk resiliency paradigm, and how the time constructs fall into that paradigm, and then sharing some tidbits of research over the few years that have led to today, and coming up with some conclusions. And I've already been told by some of my colleagues that they have questions that they'll be asking me later on. So I look forward to engaging with that. So when we think about time, we can think of a number of things. Guests arriving for a dinner party in 2 hours, and in fact, you're not quite ready. The length of the flight from San Francisco to Frankfurt, which I made just a few days ago. If we are more scientifically minded, we may think of the theory of relativity, the space-time continuum, and I'm a huge sci-fi fan, so Avengers Endgame time travel, which we are told is actually not possible. So but it's nice to speculate, right? And of course, the idea, one of the fundamental assumptions is that time is linear. We move from past to present to future, right? And we know that, in fact, there are constraints on time. I found this particular thing quite interesting. I call it sort of the constraints for time use of US academics, with a grad student who thinks he's going to research whatever he wants to do. And then decides he has to do what his professor wants him to do. Of course, and his tenure committee, if he was going to become a tenured professor, and then whatever the grant committee wants him to do, and until he researches in peace. But we exist in time, and so it's something that's very much present with us. We measure time, the rising of the sun, clocks, watches, and so forth. We remember the past, good times and bad. I was sharing my very first public talk, which was a disaster when I was in secondary school. We act in the present, we plan for the future, college, careers, vacations. And so all of this time is ubiquitous, it's always with us. And one of the views of time I had came from my mother. I didn't think of it in those terms in those days, but the 10th stanza of the Ladder of St. Augustine by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow goes, "The heights by great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward through the night." And so this idea of working in the present to achieve something in the future, very much a part of this poem. And in fact, in looking up the poem to share with my mom, she could never remember where she had seen it. Thank God for Dr. Google. I saw the whole poem, and I actually saw that the whole thing was about time, including the last stanza, which talks about we are building, even if when the past doesn't work, to the extent that it lifts us up into the future, that in fact it has done its job. And so it's with this that I came to the risk resiliency paradigm. As shared by our director, my PhD program, I went to my PhD program with an interest in dropouts. I had been a principal of a continuation high school in Trinidad and Tobago for students who had flunked out or dropped out of the regular system. And my graduate program had a focus on prevention, and the risk resiliency paradigm was an important aspect of that, right? Risk factors are biological, psychosocial, or environmental hazards that increase the probability of a negative outcome. Certainly one of the most potent of these is poverty, all around the world, but of course family dysfunction. There are a number of risk factors we can think about. And one of our tasks as school psychologists is to try to eliminate, mitigate, or reduce risk factors, to allow students to thrive. And we do that often using protective factors, right, which are the psychosocial, individual, and environmental characteristics that in fact ameliorate or buffer a person's response to risk. And one of my advisor wrote, I think in the 1960s, she talked about emotional inoculation, right? We're still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. People have been vaccinated, but we often don't think of vaccinations in terms of psychological vaccinations. And so this idea that, in fact, we can vaccinate against future risk is something that, in fact, was really near and dear to me. As part of those studies, I was once again introduced to Erikson's theory, psychosocial theory. We went into it a bit more depth than I'd done as an undergrad. And of course, I fell in love with Erikson's name. I just love that name. And my older sister married a Mr. Frank. And I tried to convince her to name one of her sons after me. She would not do that. I thought Frank, Erikson, I thought it would make a good name. But Erikson's theory, Erikson talks about these 8 ages of man. It was a sexist theory, the product of the time. Focusing on the first 5 stages. Infancy. The infant is developing a sense of trust versus mistrust. And so the resolution of that trust versus mistrust in adolescence, which Erikson saw as a pivotal period, is hope, right? Clearly a time construct. And so that the infant who is fed, when he's hungry, or who is changed when she needs to be changed. They develop a sense of trust in the world. And so you have this idea that this trust, hope, becomes time perspective in adolescence. He also talked about stage 4, the school age, that in fact, the industry versus inferiority development of competence leads to what we call an anticipation of achievement. That we have developed competence, we can do things. And so both of these are time constructs. Again, so time came up again. And so to put this back into the definition of risk and protective factors, we have these psychosocial variables, right, that act as risk factors or protective factors. And I was fascinated by those. Importantly, the factors that are protective factors for youth who are at risk are also good for youth who are not at risk. They're promotive factors, right? And I think sometimes as those of us who are in the health service psychologists, clinical counseling, and school, we tend to focus only on ameliorating risk rather than promoting thriving and stuff. And so this idea of promoting thriving, and I study both youth who are at risk, but youth who are gifted and talented and who are actually aiming for the stars, if you wish. So there are lots of psychosocial factors. These are attitudes, cognitions, emotions that affect and are affected by our social context. I have a list of them on the side: a sense of belonging, growth mindset, and grit, which have become very big in the United States over the last decade or so. Motivation, of course, self-concept, and I would add time perspective to this list. And one of the studies that we read when I was in grad school, actually when I was doing my dissertation, is a study by Wyman et al., which I think is sort of really set the stage for the work that I do. They identified 2,000 plus students who were from the inner city, and they had the parents rate the children on the number of stresses that they had. And so students who had 4 or more stresses, and they formed some subgroups of kids. Those who had 2 or more stresses, but one subgroup was based on the child's adjustment from 3 sources: parent, former teachers, and current teachers. So we have these, right? And the parents' reports of the stressful experiences, right? And what we ended up with is they actually ended up with 2 groups. I think I've left out a slide here: stress-affected and stress-resilient groups, which are shared, right? So what they found in the moment was that students who had a high sense of future expectations, right, that in fact those future expectations were correlated with competence, with reading achievement, with teacher school engagement, and with social emotional adjustment, and negatively correlated with anxiety and depression. So we have these correlations between future expectations that these kids have and these other variables. Importantly, they were able to show that, in fact, the correlations were not just correlations with other student variables, because the students filled out the future orientation measure. So it was correlated with perceived competence and locus of control, but it was also correlated with teachers' ratings of social emotional adjustment and school engagement. And so it's going beyond just the child. And perhaps the most important finding in that study for me was this interaction where you have the students, when stress was low, and this is 2 years later, when those who were under low stress, it didn't matter whether their future orientation was high or low. But when stress levels were high, when there were a lot of risk factors, then there's a lot of negative things happening in the children's environments, the students who succeeded, who thrived, were the ones with high future expectations. And so that, this here is really, and so that for me was, in fact, something that was really worth pursuing. So bringing us back then to this idea of time perspective, right? Which Kurt Lewin in 1951 described as the totality of an individual's views of his psychological future and psychological past existing at a given point in time. There are certainly other views on time. Lewin in 1935 talked about we are focused on the present, but that we learn from a life that includes both past and future. And Lawrence Frank talked about all human conduct being conditioned by time perspective. That's a huge statement. all human conduct. And so I set about going to study time perspective. Piaget actually, of course, also mentioned in his cognitive development theory the importance of time as a construct. And one of the things I discovered is that there are a lot of constructs that are really time constructs that we don't think of that way. For example, nostalgia, a fond remembrance of the past, is that we are looking, it's a time construct, even though we don't think of it that way necessarily. Right? Positive view of the past, regret, a negative view of the past, self-concept and self-esteem. How do we feel about ourselves in the current moment in time? And so there are present-oriented constructs, and there are a host of future-oriented constructs, and these are just, of course, some of the ones that are possible. I'll include a couple studies from Hope and Perceived Life Chances a little later on, right? But all of these things, optimism, hope, all of these constructs are telling us about typically positive expectations in the future. So we also have some constructs that, in fact, cross time periods. Self-efficacy is a really potent educational construct. And self-efficacy is that I can do X, and if I do X, Y will happen. If I can study, I know how to study effectively, and that will lead to my degree, or to me passing this examination, or to me playing the cello very well. Julie Andrews, one of my favorite singers when I was growing up. I grew up with The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins and so forth. And she told the actors playing the Von Trapp kids, she gave them a bit of advice, and that is, let me see if I get it correct. An amateur rehearses so they get it right. A professional rehearses so they do not get it wrong, right? That the work in the present sets up that future. And self-efficacy, I think, plays that role. And fatalism, this idea that everything is preordained, so it doesn't matter what I do now, the future is going to be what it is. Another one of my favorites, I'm a cartoon fan. My mother doesn't understand. She used to say, "You have a PhD. Why are you still watching Bugs Bunny?" So Calvin and Hobbes are two of my favorite characters, and Calvin says, "I've decided to be a fatalist. All events are preordained and unalterable. Whatever will be, will be. That way, if anything bad happens, it's not my fault. It's fate." And this idea that, in fact, you've given up autonomy, I can't be blamed for anything because it was preordained. And so Hobbes trips him, and he falls. And Hobbes says, "Too bad you were fated to do that." And Calvin has decided he's no longer a fatalist. That wasn't fate. This idea that what will be, will be. I mean, I actually I was made a Sunday school teacher when I asked my Sunday school teacher, Judas is, did Judas have a choice? I mean, if this was going to happen, God knew this was going to happen, did Judas have a choice? And they made me a teacher. They didn't kick me out of Sunday school, but they made me a teacher. So anyway, so the questions that I've been pursuing for the last few years have been, do time constructs predict adaptive functioning? And can they act as protective factors for youth who are at risk? And I've been looking at this using a variety of time constructs. As I said to my economist colleagues, many of these studies are non-experimental because, of course, in fact, all of them, you can't really assign, it's like you can't assign gender, right? So the causal inferences are really based then on the strength of the theory via the support for the hypotheses that are generated. And then, of course, we have some longitudinal studies. One can do things over time and therefore infer causation rather than make strong causal inferences. So I'm going to skip through a few studies and show you my thinking over the last sort of 2 decades plus. And so this study was, does hope in the future act as a protective factor against dropping out? As I said, I worked with dropouts, and so this was based on my dissertation work. And we did actually, there was a comparison, there was a retrospective analysis, and a prospective analysis. In California at the time, the big construct that people were concerned about was school climate. Everybody felt that school climate was the construct that predicted. And so I actually decided to try to equalize risk in a couple ways. The first thing is I collected all my data on the basis of students who had been assigned to a continuation high school. So they had been sent to the continuation high school, whether they wanted to or not, that's where they were, by their school district. And it was the same district, it was one district. All these students were going to the high school. And I collected data from 3 groups of students at the time. One group was students who had dropped out from the continuous high school in the previous 2 years. Another group was students who had graduated from that continuation high school in the previous 2 years. And a third group was students who were actually in the high school at the time. They had not, they were still in school. A few years later, a couple of years later, I went back and I had the students who had dropped out, students who had graduated, and so I had a retrospective analysis and a prospective analysis. I'm not sharing the retrospective data, but in the retrospective analysis, school climate actually came out as the important predictor of graduation, right? So it would seem as if school climate did play a role, but my belief was that if you are in school, that your belief, your future expectations, your hope will actually affect how you interpret the climate of the school. And so in the prospective analysis, that's what we found. That when we did discriminant function analysis, we tried to classify the 2 groups. The 2 things that predicted for the students who had been in school while data were collected were cutting school, missing school a lot, and negative behaviors. But the classification was not above chance, it was not statistically significant, whereas when you added protective factors, hope predicted a 78% correct classification. And it was actually a lack of hope variable. It was a single item variable. It was my first attempt at scale development, and if there are grad students in the audience, if you fail the first time, try again. You'll eventually succeed. The scale did not work, so I ended up with a single variable, and the variable was the future looks dismal. The students who agreed with that, who rated that highly, that the future looks dismal, it's not going to work out, were the ones who dropped out of school, and the students who disagreed were the ones who stayed in school. So that was comparing, so we go to vulnerable at risk, resilient at risk. So then another study where we compared students who were not at risk and students who were resilient at risk. And the hypothesis here was that these students would differ on several variables, but not on the protective factors. They would differ on the markers, so that the not at risk group, in fact, was a gifted and talented group. So the idea was that they would do very well on the academic variables, substantially better than the at-risk group. That the at-risk group would report substantially more risk than the not at-risk group, but that on the protective factors, they would not differ. And this is what we found. So when you look at this, you can see the gifted students reporting substantially higher GPA. They see college as more academic competence. They see college as more important. The at-risk students are reporting cutting days substantially more, negative behaviors, and so forth. But when we get to the ideas of expecting a good job, hope in the future, and even self-esteem over here, that there are no differences. And so this idea, so we have not at risk and resilient at risk, not differing on protective factors. Protective for one, promotive for the other. We have the resilient at risk differing from the... And so the next study, we looked at all 3 groups. We had a not at risk group, again, an academically talented group, a resilient at risk group, and sort of a general at risk group. And the idea of using gifted and talented students as a not at risk group, one can say, well, you're setting the bar too high. We wanted to actually say these are students who are definitely not at risk for dropping out. They may decide to do other things, but they're not at risk for academic failure. And I used the measure called the measure of perceived life chances, which I'll show in another study. This is a general factor looking at your belief about your global future. And what are the chances you'll graduate from high school? You'll have a job that pays well. You'll be able to live where you want to. You'll have good friends you can count on. So you can see it's a very broad and general measure, right? And we had 3 groups. Again, the gifted group, academic program. We had the continuation school group, the general at-risk group. And we had a group of kids who were at risk and who had been given the option of participating in a mentoring program. And we took the ones who said, yes, I want to be in that program. I've been identified and I choose to participate, right? We're saying that the decision to participate was our measure of resilience in the moment. And we looked at them on self-esteem and perceived life chances. I should point out that in the 1990s, California spent over $700,000 trying to increase the self-esteem of students who are at risk and thinking that that would stop them from dropping out of school. And I thought that they should have given the money to me because I didn't think they were right. And the data bear that out. That in fact, when you look at self-esteem, the groups do not differ significantly, or there's neither statistical significance nor practical significance on self-esteem, which is the blue line. But when you see this is a general risk group, perceived life chances, when you look at perceived life chances, you can see that the mentoring program, the resilient at-risk group, and the not at-risk group are reporting equivalent, very similar perceived life chances. So again, now we're comparing all 3 groups. And then the last study in this part here has to do with, it's a study that was not published. It's a student's master's thesis. And this is a teacher ed student. She was getting her teaching credential. And they are not students who I usually work with, but she came and asked to work with me. She was interested in psychosocial factors, and she actually had a very specific thing she wanted to check out. She was from the state of Georgia. And in the state of Georgia, several states in the South, there's a group of people who are called travelers. They're also referred to as American gypsies, right? And so this is a group that is a white ethnic group, but they're separatist in some sense. I also study cultural identities, and so often in what you find when you look at white, black, Hispanic groups, the ethnic minority groups report higher ethnic identity than white groups. So this was but a white ethnic group, which we had not looked at before. And the area that they lived in was rural, and the travel group, they tended to be the wealthier people in that rural area because they're very collectivist. They live as a group. When the girls are in middle school, the girls that typically don't finish middle school, they're pulled out of school to be married. The boys go on the road with their parents, with a father typically, and then they bring money back. And so they build bigger houses in the neighborhood and so forth. And so we looked at it, and we looked at both perceived life chances and hope. And this time, one of our hypotheses was not supported, but we think it makes sense. So these are the 2 groups, and it's a very small group, right? Now, the traveler group, by the way, has no females in it. These are middle schoolers. The females have all left school already. The traveler group is all male. The other group has 41% females. And they're both small groups, as you can see, because the total N is 37. When you look at perceived SES, how they're thinking about themselves, the traveler group, as suspected, reported higher SES. They did not differ on the perceived utility of education. Right? The traveler group reports higher ethnic identity. So even though they're a white group, they're reporting higher ethnic identity than the other white group. They report lower other group orientation. Well, they are a group that's very collectivist and inward-looking, so they're not engaging with other groups. Parental expectations, the non-travelers are reporting the higher parental expectations, which makes sense. And then we come to the 2 future-oriented variables, hope and perceived life chances. And my hypothesis was that both of them would have been higher for the non-travelers. But as you can see, perceived life chances were higher for the non-travelers, and you all have just seen that variable. What are the chances you can live wherever you want to, and those kinds of things, have a future that you want. The non-travelers are saying, yes, we have that belief. Hope here, the hope variable is a variable, I'll show a bit more about that. It consists of two parts, agency and pathways. The belief that you can accomplish your goals, right? So there's a sense, it's really correlated to self-efficacy, right? And the ability to envision multiple paths to your goals. Well, the traveler group are a group that are making it in society on their own. They're not doing the regular thing, the school thing, but they're going out into the world and making it. And so it makes sense to me then that our hypothesis was wrong, that on this idea of hope and agency and pathways, this is a group that can go out into the world and do their own thing, so they have higher hope. But they do not have higher perceived life chances because they don't think that they will actually have the benefits of society that the non-travel group has, right? So this scale, the hope scale, when I discovered that, we've done a few studies with the hope scale, and one of my former students is now doing a lot of work on hope. We know that academic self-concept predicts student achievement. It's a very strong correlate to student achievement, and so we wanted to ask, does hope then predict academic self-concept? We also know that hope predicts student achievement, but we wanted to see if there was a thing. So in this study, this is a study, this is my former student, Dante Dixon, he's at Michigan State. He and another one of my doctoral students did this study looking at African-American students in particular, because one of the concerns we have in psychology is that sometimes some of the findings that we have for white families do not necessarily work with minority families. And so you want to double check that in fact the theoretical perspectives you're having are cutting across groups. And so here we see that that hope is predicting both agency and pathways are predicting academic self-concept, right? Study 1 and study 2, as you can see, they're predicting more than standardized test scores, predicting more than parent education, predicting higher than age, and so forth. So, and the other hope study, this was a study where we looked at groups. We grouped people on their hope and agency scores. So if you have a low hope, low agency, low pathways, you are a low hoper. High agency, high pathways, you are a high hoper. And then we have the high agency group and the high pathways group. And we found what we thought we would find, that in fact the people who are the high hopers are reporting in fact higher scores on things like academic self-concept, academic investment, self-esteem, school belonging, etc. Luckily in this study we had one negatively coded variable, and you get to see the difference, which makes your inferences stronger. We had perceived stress. We see that the low hopers are reporting the highest perceived stress, and the high hopers are reporting the lowest perceived stress. So we have this pattern. So this idea about future constructs, so these are future constructs, and they're predicting resilience pretty well. So let's turn our attention to sort of multiple time periods. Philip Zimbardo is a name that probably many people, certainly psychologists, know. He's in the intro psychology textbooks, the Stanford Prison Study, and in 1999, Zimbardo and Boyd, he published a thing called the Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory. And in that article, he noted that a high score on the future, which we study a lot, does not necessarily tell you anything about how somebody thinks about the past and the present. And if we think about the time perspective definition, the time perspective definition talks about the future is not just dependent on the future, it's dependent on the present and the past. So we really should be looking at a multi-period kind of study rather than just looking at the future. So I was actually able to quote T.S. Eliot, a British poet, in one of my articles. Time past and time present are both present in time future, and time future contained in time past. My co-authors indulge me when I try to do these things. And I always say, well, let's see what the reviewers say. If they don't say take it out, we can leave it in there. And this one made it in. So time perspective then is a more general variable than just looking at the future, right? We're looking at the past. And in Zimbardo's inventory, past positive, past negative, present hedonistic, present fatalistic, future planning. So he had these five subscales, 2 past, 2 present, and 1 future. And a colleague of mine who became my first postdoc, Zina Mello, brought this to me. She was a doctoral student at Penn State, and she was looking for somebody who did work on time to be an outside member of a committee. And she came bearing gifts, the Zimbardo article, which I had not seen. And I agreed to be on her dissertation committee, and I also said to her, well, why don't we collect some data? Because she studied adolescence, I studied adolescence, and Zimbardo had done much of his work with college students. So we actually collected some data, and what we found is that the scores did not work as well as expected. We thought that it was potentially because we were working with adolescents and not with college students. The future scale split into 2, which we labeled a future positive and a future negative. The scores were modestly related to hope. They were not related to academic achievement at all, and we were a little surprised, because I think I had been quite taken when I saw that scale. This was something that, in fact, we really should be doing. So after that scale didn't work that well, we started to look at the psychometrics and continued that over time. And for those of you who are lay people, when we are measuring psychological constructs, we want to make sure that the scores that we have are reliable. That is, if you have a score today, you'll have roughly the same score tomorrow or next week. We also want to make sure that the scores are valid, right? So true. And so we have a number of ways of measuring reliability and validity. I'm going to show you a lot of numbers now, and what I want you to look at is the colors. It's pretty. The prettier it is, it means that the less reliability and validity, right? So we've done a number of studies, and others have done studies looking at the Zimbardo scale, and we found there were problems with the reliability and with the validity. And so I then left Penn State and went to Berkeley, and Zina actually finished and came to work with me as a postdoc, and we decided, in fact, that we would develop a scale for adolescents along the lines of the Zimbardo scale. And that has, in fact, much of the rest of the work, what I'll talk about today, is on that. So, the Mello model of time perspective, she pushed me into doing this, so I think she should get the credit. And basically, we have 5 sections: time meaning, how do you define the past, present, and future? Time orientation, where's your emphasis? Time relation, how do you see the time periods as related to each other? Time frequency, how often do you think about the past, present, future? And time attitudes, which has taken on a life of its own, and which I'll spend much of the rest of my time with today, positive and negative attitudes towards the future. So it's a simple thing. How do you define the past? How do you define the present? How do you define the future? Neither Zina or I are really major qualitative researchers. We've not done a lot with this, but we've had adolescents tell us, it's like a window. I think the most poetic of my titles, I think the title of the article is The Window, the River, and the Novel, all of which were metaphors that adolescents used to describe time, and so forth, and looking at it. Time orientation is done with circles. So like this is past, this is present, this is future, this is past, present. So they pick one of these, right? And what we have found is that, like in a sample that we did, that the present future group reported the highest self-esteem, the highest achievement, and it was meaningfully different than people who focused on the present only. Didn't differ from the others. We have time relation, that's also measured with circles. So we have time as unrelated at the top. We have time, present, future. We have time as linearly related. You're going from the past to the present, future. And we have them as interrelated, and they choose one of them. When we, in our study of this, 53% chose the interrelated, figure 4, and 35% chose figure 3. And these two groups actually report much higher achievement than figure 1. Again, this is not something we've done a lot with. The time frequency, we found that they think a lot about time, mostly the present and so forth. We've not done I think we've done one study with this looking at sort of frequencies. But as I said, this is where we've done most of our work. And I want to point out a couple differences here from the Zimbardo scale. Zimbardo did two things in a scale that we think led to the problems. One is that he measured behaviors, he measured cognitions, and he measured emotions. He was trying to get the full breadth. So each subscale had items that reflected multiple things. He also measured, I think, what constructs that I think were time constructs, but not necessarily the way he thought it was. So one of his present scales is present fatalism. Well, I would argue that fatalism is both present and future-oriented. It's not just a present-oriented scale. And so in some sense, I think he was mixing constructs together. So we decided we would focus on emotion, since we know that emotion often trumps cognition when we are angry, for example, or, and stuff. So we would measure attitudes, emotion, and we would not include other constructs. So past positive, past negative, present positive, present negative, and so forth. I'll run through the next slides. It's not as colorful. The scales are working generally well in many countries. So a lot of that. I'm a measurement person, among other things, so I have to show that. And so now this is sort of the heart. Are these time attitude scores markers of risk and resiliency? And are they associated with adaptive functioning? And the first question in the context of the United States is, in fact, are we seeing substantial differences among racial ethnic groups, right? And what we are finding is we are not seeing substantial differences. We are seeing some differences, but they're not consistent. So for example, when we look at socioeconomic status here, the positives are reporting, 35% of the positives are middle SES. So negatives, we have both the high SES and the low SES having a higher percentage. So there doesn't seem to be a consistent relationship. We did another study with a substantially larger sample. Again, here we have the ambivalent group had slightly higher percentage that had less than high school. But so if we look at the positives, the graduate degree, having a graduate degree and having a bachelor's degree put you a bit above the others, but again, these differences are not huge. We are finding not substantial differences by gender as well. I think I did education level already. Actually, I think that's not education level. I forgot to change the top. I changed the slide, but not the top. That's ethnic racial group, and as you're seeing, there's not a substantial differences by ethnic group. European Americans are more likely to be in the positives group, and the African Americans are more likely to be in the conflicted group. And when we look at the scores, we are finding that African Americans, perhaps not surprisingly in the United States, are reporting higher negative attitudes than other groups. Much of the racial tension in the US is black-white. So then now let's look at some. So let's start with the thing that's closest to self-esteem on the negative side is depression. And when we look at students who report feeling sad or hopeless for the last 2 weeks, for at least 2 weeks in the last 12 months, we can see positive attitudes are the ones, their positive attitudes are higher, then lower, their negative attitudes are higher, right? So the ones who say no, they are having a higher positives, lower negatives. The ones who say yes, they are having the higher negatives and lower positives. Behavior, I'm not sure if you all have a lot of, I don't know the German data about use of alcohol and tobacco in schools and other substances, secondary schools, but we can see here, it was surprising, it doesn't seem as if the positive things relate to alcohol and tobacco. Past positive, present positive, future positive, no changes. But use of cigarettes in school, for 20 to 30 days, so people are using them heavily in school in the last 30 days, you can see that they're reporting substantially higher negative attitudes, past negative, present negative, and future negative. Interestingly, when you go to more hardcore substances, marijuana and other things, now you're seeing the pattern. The positives are coming into the play as well. So those who are not using marijuana, not using drugs at all, are reporting higher positives and lower negatives, and those who are using marijuana and using drugs are reporting higher negatives and lower positives. In a study that just came out earlier, about a month ago, I guess this month, I guess it would be, this is a clinical sample of 68 people there in their 30s. They were diagnosed with mood disorders in their, they were evaluated for and then diagnosed with mood disorder, some of them, in their teens, when they were teenagers. And so we had them, they were in attending a clinic in the UK, and we had them take the scale, and you can see that those who are reporting lifetime mood disorder, the ones with the diagnosis, are reporting higher negatives, lower positives. So, we have this standard pattern showing up. So we are seeing it in adolescents, we are seeing it in adults, we are seeing it in clinical and non-clinical samples, and we are seeing it across national context. Although one can argue that the UK and America are probably very similar in some ways. So the other claim that Zimbardo made is that we really need to be looking not just at the individual scores, we need to be looking at the profile. Because I may have a high future or a high present, but how does that relate in relation to the rest of the scores? So we have these 6 scores, and so we then decided we would look at profiles or clusters, as we can call them. And the first study was done here actually at Heidelberg. Monica Buell and one of her graduate students, they did the first set of clusters, and they used these spider graphs. Those spider graphs are a little confusing to me. I prefer things that are simpler to understand, and so I use the bar graphs. And basically what you have here is we name the profiles on the basis of how high or above or how far above or below the mean they are, and stuff. This is from a US sample. These are from 2 samples in the UK. What we have found is, using cluster analysis, we have found some clusters that are more common than others, positives, negatives, pessimists. Using latent profile analysis, the positives, negatives are again among the most common. We have an ambivalent cluster that shows up with latent profiles. And there's some, so we've gotten a fair amount of consistency and replication. And so let's start with education. I'm a school psychologist. And this is from Monica's study here, where you have that individuals who are balanced or positive are reporting higher trust in school, they're reporting higher perceived support in school, and higher teacher-student relationships. And I think it's important to note here, these are individuals in the same school. And so it seems as what the time attitudes are doing, what these profiles are doing, they are lenses with which you are seeing the world. So, you could have dark shades on and everything is gloomy, or you can have on rose-colored glasses. And so you can think of these profiles in that kind of a way, right? The same pattern in New Zealand, attitude towards school, attitude towards teacher, the positives are actually reporting substantially higher than other groups. Here is school achievement, and not self-reported achievement. This is achievement from school records. And so this is independent of the student. And we're seeing that the ones who are positives are reporting higher GPAs than those who are ambivalent and those who are conflicted. Singapore, same pattern. And we did a study a couple of years ago on academically talented adolescents, and was interested because we weren't expecting to find differences in this group. These are students who are doing really well in school. This is not a risk sample entire, this is a high achieving sample. And it's interesting to note, the hours on homework, they didn't differ. They didn't differ on the number of hours studying. They didn't differ on how challenging they found the program. In support of the lens hypothesis, they are seeing the world differently. They are reporting, the positives are reporting a higher level of enjoyment than the negatives and stuff. And that's actually translating, even though there are no differences in how difficult they find the work. It seems to be translating into outcomes, educational and behavioral outcomes. We find the same kinds of differences on these constructs: life satisfaction, self-efficacy, perspective taking, on other constructs such as hope and hopelessness. We are even finding it on, because the other thing to deal with resilience, right, is if I'm in a stressful situation, how do I respond? How do I cope, right? We have some data from Slovenia where we are showing that, in fact, positives are more likely to engage in planning, an adaptive coping construct, positive reappraisal, positive refocus, right? With the negatives are much less likely to do that. On the other hand, negatives are much more likely to ruminate, to catastrophize, to blame others. So that again, we are seeing on both sides that, right? And for people who are any fans of the Big Five personality characteristics, perhaps not surprisingly, the positives are higher on conscientiousness and extroversion, and the lowest on neuroticism, while the negatives are the highest on neuroticism. We're seeing it in depression and anxiety. This is, again, the UK. This is a UK sample. And in a very recent dissertation study, South Korea has a very big problem with adolescents using the internet, problematic internet use. And we are seeing that the positives are much less likely to be engaging in problematic internet use. And we're seeing the same pattern. For the last set of slides, really looking at the longitudinal outcomes to try to get at some things over time. This study was on alcohol use, and what happened is we did the clusters at time 1 and time 2. We found the same clusters at both time periods, and so we looked at people who stayed in the same cluster from time 1 to time 2. And we also had data on whether they didn't drink at all, whether they were abstainers, were they engaged in supervised drinking, unsupervised drinking, or both. The positives were much more likely to be abstainers, and the negatives, future negatives and ambivalents, were much more likely to do both types of drinking. The negatives were the ones who were most likely to engage in unsupervised drinking. We've seen, so the other thing to note is that one of the concerns here was that, the profiles are not stable. And as I said to my colleagues, that's a good thing, because what it sets up is intervention. If people can change profiles, it means that we can do stuff to help them change from a negative profile to a positive profile. So in other longitudinal work, we're seeing that staying in the positive sample, this is over 2 years now, the other was a lower likelihood of using cannabis compared to other profiles, a lower likelihood of having smoked, moving to the positive, a significantly less likelihood of lifetime smoking, moving to the negative, increased likelihood of lifetime smoking. We're finding the same thing with self-efficacy, moving to the positive. Your academic self-efficacy goes up. Staying in the positive is increased academic self-efficacy. Staying in the negative, decreased self-efficacy. And we found this with social self-efficacy as well as emotional self-efficacy. And Tejada Gallardo et al. In Spain, I do not know these researchers, I found this in the literature, did an intervention study where they actually measured, they used the time attitude scale, they did profiles at time 1 and time 2, and they did a 6-session positive psychology intervention for one group, random assignment, over time. And what they found is that the individuals who got in the intervention group were more likely to transition to the optimistic and positive profile if they were in a negative profile, and they reported higher well-being. So the time attitude scores have been used in a number of contexts. I mean, so it's as I said, the time attitudes have taken on a life of their own. And to conclude, it seems as if positive time constructs act as protective factors in at-risk youth and promotive factors in youth who are not at risk. Again, for those of you who are familiar with musicals, I mean, Annie, The sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow there'll be sun. So it seems as if these time attitudes, not just future, but more generally, actually are predicting youth. Negative time constructs increase risk, and the time constructs are associated with an incredibly broad range of variables across national and cultural context. We had not expected to find this, and in fact, when we first did the scale, a senior colleague who studies future orientation basically told us, it's never going to work. You need to do a domain-specific measure, and this is a domain general measure. But I think because it's based on emotion, we think that that's one of the reasons why it's working as well. And certainly one of the things we need more intervention studies to see if we can change outcomes and behaviors by changing attitudes and profiles. In the Tolkien books, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and so forth, those of you who are fans of the movie or the books, you know that the one ring, the idea of the one ring that controls them all, right? So psychology has long been on a quest for an Uber. I'm probably not pronouncing that correct. My umlaut is never very good. An Uber construct. We start with self-esteem. We've talked about certainly stereotype threat, grit, growth mindset. And I would suggest maybe it's time constructs. But of course, I may be biased. And with that, I'll say thank you for your attention.
So we still have like a little bit of a ceremony at the past. Thank you very much for this really wonderful lecture and really inspiring along many different dimensions. I think the reflections in terms of how time, hope, and attitude really comes together is really impressive. I found particularly interesting kind of also the disconnection between hope and self. I mean the perceived self chances and how that might actually really differ in terms of how people or how young people also see themselves. I thought a little bit that maybe the academic community might be also a good study example. In Germany, we have a lot of discussions about academic career records, lack of tenure track, perceived chances, but maybe also perceived hope. And maybe to study this could also contribute in terms of how we might actually change also some parts in the kind of academic system in Europe, in particular in Germany. In Germany, I think this Ich bin Hanna movement really also is an expression of lack of hope, lack of perceived chances in the future. So don't be surprised if kind of people basically kind of talk to you about this in at the reception or at the colloquium afterwards. So, however, before we move on to the kind of balayage to drinks and further discussion, we really want to express our gratitude for you coming here to talk to us about kind of your research and overarching concept. And as an expression of our appreciation, we award you the Marsilius Medal. And I can tell you a little bit of a secret. So one of the as one of the Marsilius director, one of the things that we kind of always hope for and almost always doesn't work is to open actually this case. Because when it closes, it's very hard to open. So I would really like to hand over that to you and read actually the certificate. Oops. So the Marsilius Medal is presented to Professor Frank C. Worrell by the Marsilius-Kolleg of Heidelberg University for his lecture on the topic Time Constraints, a Critical Concept in Human Functioning, and his contribution to the dialogue between scholarly cultures. Signed today by myself and my colleague, Friederike Nüssel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Yep.
As I said, it's an honor to be here, and I have to always say that it's times like these I'm glad you can't see me blush, but